Welcome to The One Inside, an internal family systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sullenberger. On today's podcast, I chat with Jay Earley about personal growth. Hey everyone, I am super excited to share this podcast with you where I chat with Jay Earley. Jay is a popular IFS teacher and leads courses on IFS and leads lots of different types of groups. I think that our chat can be broken into three sections. The first section, we talk about his story and we talk about similarities between what he refers to as sort of what Dick teaches on IFS and what he teaches. I think I have parts that are confused and I don't know Jay, and I had gotten the impression that Jay had, and I think he says this, and I hadn't really thought about it this way, but I kind of thought that he had his own model, like self-therapy journey was another type of IFS, another sort of another model, maybe. I wasn't really sure, to be completely honest. I didn't know, and I just what I had read online and what I had seen in Facebook groups and just sort of how people referred to it. So I asked about that, and I think I asked with curiosity and confusion. I really didn't know, and he handles it really graciously, and I think does a really good job explaining similarities and differences between the two. So I think that's super interesting, and that's the first part. And then the second part, we talk about capacity development, which is definitely not something that you hear a lot in IFS circles. And so the capacities of self and how we develop them. And this is the part where I start talking about I can't find a word. I'm looking for a word and I can't find it. And my intention is to ask, I'm wondering what the capacity would be for what I'm trying to say, but I get lost and I can't find the word. So I never ask him what the capacity is. So the word is scarcity. And the idea that I'm trying to say is, what about this idea of sort of the part of me that worries about not having enough time, enough money, enough food? And so, what would the capacity be for that? And so Jay and I have been emailing back and forth about that. And so, what I would love to hear from you is if you have an idea of what that would be, or maybe if you resonate with that part of mine and you have a part similar and you could think about, what the capacity of that would be, I would love for you to share that with me at IFS Tammy on Instagram or Twitter or at the One Inside Facebook page. I'm just super curious about what you guys come up with. And then the third part is the great turning, which Jay says is inner work for the world. And I just thought that whole conversation was fascinating. And then we end with just Jay sharing all of his different offerings, the different types of groups and classes and courses. He just offers so much. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're doing well. I hope the end of 2020 is safe and healthy and that you are just being so kind to all of your parts that are might be hurting for so many different reasons right now. And so I just want you to know that, just to remind you that you have a beautiful self who can be with your parts. And when self can be with those parts, there is peace and there is harmony and there is joy. Thinking of the end of the year and the holiday season, there is joy when self can be with our parts, when parts can feel that love of self. And so that is my hope for you as we end 2020. And I hope that you take really good care of yourself and all of your parts. Enjoy. Hi.
Hi.
The first question I like to ask is, where are you in the world? And if you were to look out that window that's right there, what would you see?
I am in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. And right now I'm looking out my window and I see a squirrel in a tree.
And is it very green there?
It's very green here. And when I look out this way, I see a lot more trees, and in the distance is Mount Tamalpais.
Wow,
So I
okay.
have this fabulous view here.
And have you lived in California? You've lived in California for a long time because were you on Long Island for a while?
Yeah, I lived in Berkeley for probably 20 years, and then I moved to Long Island for 10 years to be with Bonnie, and then we came back here over 20 years ago. Um,
Is Bonnie your partner?
um, Not anymore.
Oh,
We are no longer together. I actually have a new partner
okay.
in this new house. So,
Do you and Bonnie still work together?
yes.
How does
Yeah, we're
that
still
go?
friends and we still work together.
Wow.
Fine, actually. Yeah. I taught at UC Berkeley in the computer science department and did research on programming language design.
Okay. What did I see? Do you know that you have a Wikipedia page?
Yeah, yeah, I've seen it.
When
Not recently. So.
it says that you developed something. What is it that you developed?
Oh, back when I was in computer science.
Yes.
Yeah, my dissertation was a parsing algorithm. An algorithm means a procedure for doing something, and so it was a parsing as an algorithm for parsing languages. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Probably don't want to go into that too much, but yeah.
Well, I just was curious about that because I was like, how did that? So you were doing computer science and you were teaching, and then how did psychology come into play?
Well, I got into therapy myself, of
Oh,
course,
okay. Okay.
and and it was so valuable for me. And even though I enjoyed doing computer science, it wasn't. I didn't want to devote my life to it. It just. I mean, especially back then, it was mainly used in the military and stuff like it. It just wasn't something that felt meaningful to me, even though it was fun. So I decided that it would be much more meaningful to be a therapist. So I went back to school and got another PhD in psychology this time, and started doing therapy. I did it for a long time, and then I discovered, I think in 2002, I discovered IFS. A friend of mine who was a therapist told me about it, and I got Dick's book and read it, and Bonnie read it, and we both started doing IFS with our clients before we even knew what we were doing. And even then, it was pretty effective.
Right, right. And so then I know I remember thinking that too. Like I just started talking to clients about parts. Of course, I had no idea what I was doing and I was like, wow, this is really working. But yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you read the book and then did you end up meeting up with Dick? Like what happened?
Yeah. So then I took a level one IFS training, and there were two trainers for that. Mitchie Rose did half of it, and Dick did the other half. So that's how I met Dick.
Okay.
I was lucky. I mean, that was the early days when you actually got to have Dick in a level one training.
Right,
I don't think
right.
that happens anymore.
No. And then you have Mishi Rose. Like that's amazing. You have the like two pioneers of IFS do your
Right.
level one. Yeah. So you take the training and then did you know that like this is a new thing for you or like how did you
Oh yeah.
um
It was so powerful and so, easy to use. I did it, of course it became the way I worked on myself, and I actually, you know, well, actually, Mitchie, became my individual therapist for a while. So, and I just started using it with all my clients. I mean, it was so powerful that I just completely transformed the way I was doing therapy. I mean, all the other stuff I knew from the previous, 20 some years, kind of fed in the background, but really I just started pretty much exclusively doing IFS.
Okay.
Um, and and then of course I became a PA and an assistant trainer and all that. But I started teaching. No, see what order did? Yeah, I started teaching classes in IFS for both the general public and for therapists. I mean, the same class would be for both.
Okay.
Um,
And
so
you
I had a.
were you doing that under, there probably wasn't like the Center for Self Leadership probably wasn't a thing. So were you sort of just doing that on your own?
I was doing that on my own.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had a basic class and then an exiles class and taught those for a few years, and then and then I used that material to write the book Self Therapy, and that book has been extremely popular.
Yeah.
Partly because IFS has become extremely popular. Yeah, so that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I see that there's been how many thousands of copies of Self Therapy workbook is out there? Do you know?
You mean, well, there's two. There's Self Therapy, and then Bonnie did the Self Therapy workbook.
Okay, okay.
So
Yeah.
Self Therapy itself has sold 70,000 copies roughly.
Wow, wow. Okay.
And that's for a self-published book. So that's really amazing.
That is
Um,
amazing. Okay, so because you've written a bunch of books. So there's Self Therapy and then Self Therapy Workbook is the one that Bonnie wrote. Okay.
right.
And then did you continue working with, I think there's been a part of me when I first started learning about IFS, I got some, I don't even know how I found it. It was some recordings that you did, and I started listening to it thinking that it was something different. Like, so I think there was a part of me that wasn't sure like where self therapy landed and where IFS landed. And I was like, oh wait, this is IFS. Like I didn't know that it was the same. And I don't even remember
Uh-huh.
how I found you. I think it was like a free audio recording that you did. I don't know
Yeah,
where it was.
well, I did one with Tammy Simon. That might have been what you saw.
Hmm.
Or she I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I've done a bunch
Yeah,
of
it
recordings.
was a couple years ago. 'Cause I was trying to think about I think the thing is I was trying to think about like how do I know about you? Because I feel like you are just as popular as Dick. And so I think that's what I was trying to think about. Like, where did I hear your name? And I remember listening to an audio recording you did.
Hmm.
Did you continue working with Dick when you wrote the self therapy book?
Yeah, actually, Dick and I actually talked about. He had this little publishing company, Trailheads Press or Trailheads Publications, I think, and it published his books, some of his books. And so we were talking about having that organization, that sort of in-house publishing company, do my book, and then this was before the Center for Self Leadership, or before John came in. So Dick was kind of like, all he had was an assistant, you know,
Right, right.
and his assistant said, Dick, there is no way that I have the time and the energy to publish any books but yours. And
Right.
so I self-published it. Um, and yeah, so that's how that happened. Yeah, but
Okay.
Dick was supportive. I mean, I do teach IFS a little. I mean, I basically do straight IFS, but I teach it a little differently than Dick does. And
Okay.
then, of course, I've also developed things like working with the inner critic and some other things that sort of that build on IFS and add a little to it, where there's complex things like inner critics and so on. So I've sort of developed a little bit of my own stuff, but it's all basically IFS.
Gotcha. Okay. How do you teach it differently?
Dick, like when working with protectors, Dick talks about the 6 Fs, whereas I teach a step-by-step process. Um, I think at the protector level, the only real difference is that there's a step where I have people check to see if they're blended with the protector. And Dick seems to go right to how do you feel toward it, which is also a way of telling if you're blended. But so I have a separate step where, about unblending from the target part.
Okay.
It's a little bit, and also I teach it in order. Like the 6 F's are just F's. Like what? How do you know what order you do them in? So I teach it in a step-by-step, 5-step process. And then the other probably little bit of difference. Well, it may not be so different now. When in terms of working with exiles, Dick was going right from witnessing to retrieval, and sort of saying, well, as a preliminary to retrieval, maybe you'll go in and do some healing or reparenting with the exile. But it was kind of like a side thing for Dick at that time anyway. Now he calls it do-over. So I think he's actually incorporated it more. But at the time, he didn't. And so I have a separate step that I call reparenting, which is
Okay.
the same as what he now calls do-over.
Okay.
So, that was a little bit of a difference.
Okay.
But other than that, yeah, that's probably kind of pretty much, it's pretty much, I mean, I love IFS. It is so powerful and so wonderful. I basically teach it, pretty straight with just these little changes.
Do you have that that question, like sort of that magical question of how do you feel towards like do you what's your question or what's your unblending technique when you get to that spot to figure out like how blended am I with this part?
Well, there's two ways of being blended. You can be blended with the target part, or you can be blended with a part, what I call a concern part, that doesn't like the target part or wants to get rid of it. So I have two unblending steps, one for the target part and one for when you say, how do you feel toward it? That tells you if you have what I call a concern part, and then you have to unblend from that. So there's two separate unblending steps
Well, that
in
makes so
my.
much sense too, right? Like I'm unblending and asking for space so I could get to know the target part. Then once I'm doing that, I'm sort of holding my hands out. So I'm like, okay, my target part's in my hand, and then I've got sort of a line of concerned parts that don't want me to get to know the target part for whatever reason. So that
Right.
makes so much sense that would be sort of a two-step process.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think with the other thing that you're doing a little bit different, how good it feels to witness and for our exiles to be witnessed and to share their story and then to be reparented, like to have that, because that can happen so fast in like regular IFS, that can happen so fast. And so to spend more time there probably feels really good for the exile.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So it looks like you have two websites, and one is this self therapy journey, a GPS for the mind.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Why are you chuckling?
Well, that was a mixed bag. I spent 3 years and a lot of money developing that it's basically a web application for working on yourself using IFS and the pattern system, which is another thing that I developed. Well, the reason I'm chuckling is that I there were problems with the way I designed it and tested it, and so it ended up not working for most people. I mean, the people that it works for is really helpful for, but it never. It's very funny. I get it. That's the other reason I'm checking. I'll tell you in a minute. It never really took off. It never really became very popular. When COVID hit, all of a sudden, people started using it more. So it's now being used. I mean, it's still not like big, whatever, but it's being used quite a bit more now. I mean, and also, I mean, everything. My books are selling more. The stuff on our web, the the recordings of sessions and guided meditations. They're all selling a lot more since COVID came.
Mm.
I guess I don't. I guess people are feeling more of a need for therapy, or they can't afford therapy, or whatever. I don't know, but it's very interesting. It's really changed things.
It seemed like an incredibly complex system. I was like, wow, this is amazing because it like took you, we don't have
I
to talk
mean,
about
self
it.
therapy journey.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was like, wow, this was fascinating because it was a lot of like like check boxes and like, if like say you're going to work with the procrastinator, I think was the one that you did a video about. Like if you're going to work with a procrastinator, and then it sort of was like it kind of mapped it out, like it almost like mapped out your parts with all these check boxes, and it was very elaborate. And I actually thought that I thought this must have taken you a ton of time.
It did. Not just me, but I had some bunch of people working for me getting the content up, as
Yeah.
well as a programmer who did the programming.
Wow.
It was a huge project that in retrospect was, I think was, I mean, it's still out there. It's still useful for people for whom it's useful for.
Yeah.
For it to work, people have to be very self-directed, have to be very comfortable with computer stuff.
Mm,
So it works for those people, you know.
yeah. Yeah.
But
Well, and
for a lot
maybe
of other people, it's just too complex, too weird, too computer oriented, whatever, and it just doesn't fly for a lot of people.
when I wonder if it's also like the contrast between being too computer weird and being too like IFS weird. You know what I mean? Like you're naming a part and then you're giving it an image, sort of that like IFS weird, and you've got these two weird things happening at the same time.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I and my assistants did a bunch of testing, and people really got a lot out of it in the tests that we did. So I thought, okay, but what I didn't take into account is that while they were doing the tests, we were following them. I mean, one of us was following them, and so they had human support, even though that's not what it was
Oh,
designed for. I mean, and of course, I realize now that that made a big difference. Like a
wow.
lot of people who try to do it on their own without human support, unless they're really self-directed, they don't stick with it. And I have
Oh,
tried with self therapy journey to encourage people to find a partner, to have to work together, to share it with or something. And I guess some of them do, but I think that's why the funny thing, that's why our tests worked, but the actual program doesn't work as for as many people as I was expecting.
well, there was a variable that you weren't considering, the variable of being with the people and following the people. That was a
Right.
variable that you weren't considering was going to be there.
Oh, and the other thing that happened about a year ago or a year and a half ago is a guy came to me who had worked with self therapy journey, who was a programmer and and good at marketing and product design, for the tech company that he worked for. And he said, you have the potential for a great program here, but it's got all these problems, and he laid them all out. And he and I for a while were actually working on a new version of self therapy journey that took into account his expertise, but that eventually didn't happen,
Oh,
for various reasons. Um, but that's really how I learned from a guy who knew what he was doing, the mistakes that I'd made.
but I love that you put it out there, right? So it's still there, and so
It's
people
still
can use
there,
it if they want. And yeah,
and it's helpful to some people. So yeah, I'm disappointed that it wasn't more successful, but
yeah,
doesn't mean no. It's for the people who can do it. It's pretty helpful.
yeah. Well, right, and right. So parts of you obviously were really disappointed because you put all this time, all this money, all this energy into
Yeah.
it, and you thought it was going to be something. And yeah. So tell me about self therapy now. So you still tell me what self therapy is now, like as far as like workshops and groups, and it seems like there's a lot happening with it.
Well, I want to clear up something. Self therapy is the name of the book.
Okay.
Self therapy isn't. I don't consider myself as having a separate system called self therapy that's separate from IFS. No, I that's not accurate. I
Okay.
mean, I think I've heard that some people think that I have this sort of competing version of IFS that I'm competing with Dick. No, I don't see it that way.
Thank you for clearing that up because I think that's what no one has ever said that, but I think that's what I had gathered.
Hmm.
So I actually thought self-therapy is another, so this is just me in my head. Self-therapy
Hmm.
is another like version of IFS, but that is not the case.
It's, I told you, it's slightly different in the ways that I mentioned, but it's
But
just,
it's not its own model. You're like, it's
no,
still
it's not its own
IFS.
model by any means. It's really a book on IFS.
Okay.
And
Okay.
everything I do is, I mean, I've expanded IFS in certain ways that we could talk about if you want to, but it's basically, I love IFS just as it is. I mean, I'm not trying to have a separate thing. One of the things that I realized in terms of working with inner critic parts, which are just protectors that where their protective role is to judge you and shame you and all that. I realized that, and I again with inner critics, I basically just do straight IFS, but there's certain complications when you're working with inner critic parts. Like for example, whenever you have an inner critic protector, there's always an exile that is hurt by the criticisms. So we call it the criticized child or the criticized exile. And it's very important when you're working with people on an inner critic part. They often mix it up. They don't realize, oh, there's two parts here. There's the part that's attacking me, and there's the part that's being attacked, or that's hearing the attack, believing it, feeling bad about itself. That's an example.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all IFS, but it's a little more complicated than some other protectors that you work with.
Yeah. That makes
Um,
sense. Maybe it does that thing that it makes it more, I don't want to say a target part, but it makes it more clarifies it that it's not like I just have this big mean bully critic that's criticizing all of these parts and they all have a piece of it, which that could be that way too. But it's two parts, the one that's the bully and the one that feels the criticism.
right. Yeah. And of course, IFS understands what a lot of other systems don't. And this isn't just me. IFS understands that there isn't an inner critic. There are probably most people have a number of different inner critic protectors.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's a when you do IFS, you learn a lot more about the details of things than other therapy systems. They have these theories, but they haven't actually gone in and worked with the parts so that they often don't understand what's really going on or the different possibilities for what's really
Hmm.
going on. Because, for example, some systems believe that if you have a critic, that it's always directed both inward and outward toward other people. And sometimes you will have one part that does both, but sometimes not. Sometimes there's a part that just attacks you, and there may be another part that just attacks other people. So, and that's nothing. That's not my insight alone. Any good IFS therapist will realize that.
Right,
Um,
right. Well, and the idea too that the critic isn't just mean for being mean sake, right? There is a positive intention behind that critic. It's
exactly.
okay. So how do you feel about talking about capacity development work groups?
Yeah. So this is kind of what I'm most excited about these days. Is there are Dick, if you look at the self, Dick has the 8 C's, um, and they're each, but of course he says that's not all of what self is, that there's much more to self than that. And so what I've been doing, one way to look at it with the capacities, is that I'm unpacking the self in way more detail than, I mean, the 8 C's are great, but so there's many possible capacities that are aspects of self. And some of them relate directly to the IFS process itself, like compassion or respect for parts. Those are two that I've really developed pretty fully that have directly to do with the IFS process. But there's also many other but of course they also, especially compassion, also relates to how you relate to people in your life. But there's many, many other capacities that don't necessarily just help with or don't necessarily at all help with the IFS process, but they help you live your life. So, self-confidence, agency, strength, and so on. There's probably 40 or 50 of them. So I'm very slowly developing each capacity as I teach them in my personal growth groups, and I've also taught some of them in my advanced IFS classes. And right now, I've only really fully developed 7 capacities of the probably 40 or 50 that are there or that could be developed. But I'm sorry, I think I'm getting into too much detail. So a capacity, I should probably give more examples of capacities. So, for example, interpersonal capacities, intimacy, self-support, autonomy, assertiveness, cooperation, trust, appreciation, forgiveness. Then there's capacities that are related to living your life purpose, passion, creativity, courage. Well, I mentioned self-confidence. There's more spiritually oriented capacities like presence, love, joy, inner support, peace, spaciousness. I could go on, but that gives you an idea of this whole realm of capacities. And they're all, in some sense, aspects of self
Yeah.
in an IFS sense. But I find that it's really helpful for people to understand, like if somebody's working on an issue, IFS focuses, as therapy does, on the problem. Like what is you're procrastinating or you're hurt by your inner critic or whatever it is. And you work on the parts that are doing that, the protectors and then the exiles that are protecting. But if you know, like if you know that there's a capacity that you're working toward in working on this issue, it somehow helps people a lot. So if they realize, oh, I have a people pleaser part that I need to work on, but if they realize that the capacity I want to develop is assertiveness, or if I have an inner critic, the capacity I want to develop is self-esteem, it helps people. And in the class, in my groups and classes, when I teach it, I teach about the capacity. Then I teach about all the different possibilities for the different types of parts that can interfere with that capacity. And then also, hope I'm not, tell me if I'm getting into too much detail here, but each capacity, in addition to the blocks, the things that get in the way, like if the capacity is self-confidence, then obviously the inner critic is going to be something that gets in the way. But you can also have what I call unevolved versions of the capacities. So let's take compassion, for example. An unevolved version of compassion would be caretaking, where you take care of people at the expense of your own needs, or even without being clear on what they actually need. So
Right.
caring is also a capacity, and caretaking is sort of the unevolved version of caring.
Right. Okay.
So
Yeah.
so anyway, without
No,
hope I don't get it.
no, it's so interesting. I love it. Yeah, that makes
So
sense. So you're finding that it helps people, like say if I come and I say I really want to get rid of this people please, part of me, if I know a little bit about IFS, I'll say, part of me is a people pleaser and then I have parts that don't like that. And then it's helpful to have someone see or know kind of where they want to go, like the capacity that they want to develop. I want to develop my assertiveness. I want to develop being able to use my voice. I want to
right.
develop that self characteristic capacity of self, the
Eh,
capacity of self to be able to use my voice without feeling guilty or embarrassed or ashamed or having to eat all the cookies afterwards.
right. And what I'm working on now, in addition, and of course, in the groups, we identify the capacities and people identify the ways that they're blocked or the ways they have unevolved versions. And then, of course, we do IFS, of course, to work through those parts, to heal the exiles, to get the protectors to let go. But I'm also having ways of helping people directly embody the capacity or practices that they can do at home to develop the capacity from. So I'm sort of doing it from both ends, working because you have to do the IFS on the protectors and exiles, but it's also really helpful to do this work for directly developing the capacity.
I love that because I was thinking, like, let's say with the people pleasing, so I'm working with my people pleaser part, and then like at home, I'm embodying, maybe I'm embodying being able to really speak up and be assertive and playing with how embodying that and how that would feel if I could stand up for myself and I could tell someone what I really actually think. Like, and I could really play with what that,
You
with
got
that.
it. You got
Yeah,
it.
I love it. I love it.
And the other thing is that there are some capacities that are subtle enough that people may not even recognize that. For example, agency is a very important capacity, and it's subtle. It's hard to even understand because it's not the same as assertiveness or personal power. It's knowing that you're in charge of your life and you're in charge of your growth, and it's extremely important in therapy. Like I've found that if I'm working with a client and they don't have agency around the therapy itself, it's not going to work. So I will bring that up with them if the issue of agency. It's crucial with certain clients. I mean, some people have it fine; it's not ever an issue. But it's a subtle kind of capacity that. So some of the capacities are obvious, like compassion or assertiveness, but some of them are a little subtler that people don't even know about it
Like they
until
don't
we
even
work on it.
realize it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I love that. I feel that way about what is the word? I always forget the word, which I think is interesting, about the idea of like I'm not going to have enough. Right? I'm not going to have enough. There's not going to be enough time. There's not going to be enough food. There's not going to be enough water. There's not going to be enough.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And I know the word you're thinking of, and I can't think of it either. It's a deficiency mentality. I don't know if that's the word you were thinking. Probably not, but anyway,
No.
I get the idea.
And I wonder about how many, like you're saying, how many capacities that we don't even realize are available or that affect us.
Hmm.
And so I think one of the things that I loved about the GPS, go back to this website that nobody uses anymore, or they're starting to use. I loved that there were some choice points that I hadn't even realized. I was like, oh, I don't, and I can not gonna be able to think of one, but I loved that. And so I wonder if that's probably also helpful for people, just like with the C's, maybe there's some C's that I could invite in or I could want a little bit more of that I didn't even realize I didn't have.
Yeah. And of course, Dick's approach to helping people be in self and develop and have the capacities is what he calls constraint releasing. You find the part that's in the way and you get it to step aside, or if or you unburden it. You and of course that is very important. But I have found that that's not all that can be done. That you can also
Yeah.
directly work on. Which and Dick might not be entirely happy about that because he's very strong on only doing constraint releasing because he doesn't want to diss any parts. But I haven't found that. When I do the capacity work, people don't say, "Oh, my protector really doesn't like you're doing this." So far anyway, I haven't found people reporting that their parts are unhappy with working directly on capacities.
Well, what was coming up for me is that, and of course, I don't know that I could speak for this, but I think that maybe what Dick would have a hard time with, and again, I can't speak for this, is that self doesn't need development. What about
Right.
that idea, right? Like we don't need to develop self, or self doesn't need our help, like the resourcing, right? Self doesn't need us to resource it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I also understand sort of hitting it both ways, right? I'm working with my parts, doing the constraint release thing, and then I'm also coming around the side, giving a little lift with the assertiveness, embodying my assertiveness, or
Hmm.
my yeah. Is that what you mean?
Yep. You got it. Exactly.
What about the great turning group? I'm really curious about this.
So, I'm my understanding, and this is not my own. This is from a lot of people Like Joanna Macy was the one who coined the term the Great Turning. And the basic understanding is that our society has, especially the modern era society, has run its course. Like all the stuff that you see going on in the world, or a lot of it, is because we're at a crossroads in social evolution, the human race. We have, there have been a number of different stages in social evolution, and the modern industrial era is the most recent stage. And it was good in its own way for many people, although not for some other people. But it's now created problems that it can't solve within its worldview. And so our society is breaking down. And we see that. I mean, of course, the rise of the right wing demagogues, of which Trump is one, is the most obvious thing. I mean, of course, that's what we're all concerned with right now, getting rid of Trump. And that it has to be the immediate number one priority. But we've got way bigger problems than that. Our society is breaking down, and climate change is the potential killer. And so we have to, in the sort of medium term, we have to actually create an entirely new society that functions in a healthy way. And that's what the Great Turning is. It's turning from the old way to an entirely new society, not only in terms of consciousness and values and worldview, but also in terms of social structures, the economy, the political system. Everything is change or has to change,
Mm.
and that's why you see all the breakdown, that's going on now, of which COVID has accelerated parts of it, but it was happening anyway. Anyway, so that's the Great Turning. And what I think there is a sort of very small, I mean, not small, but very kind of under the radar movement toward the Great Turning, toward making those changes. It's not like nothing's going on and we have to create it out of whole cloth. It is happening, but it's not in the news, and it's not very well coordinated among there's all kind. When I've done research, there's all kinds of fascinating, creative steps toward a new society that are happening, but you never read about it in the mainstream news.
Mm.
And so I consider that a movement for the Great Turning, but I think it needs to be, you know, publicized, coordinated, all those kinds of things. So I decided that my little contribution would be running some Great Turning groups. So I started 2 groups, which are free, and I kind of only half the leader. I'm also half a participant, and people are starting to take over leadership more in these groups. And so we do all kinds of different. So this is, you might consider these Great Turnings groups sort of inner work for the world. There's another way to think about it. That's my sort of subtitle. And so we do, like for example, actually I didn't bring this in. One of the women brought in working on our racist parts. So we did a session on that, and we've also done sessions on finding your life purpose as a contribution to the Great Turning, and working through blocks that get in the way of your being more effective as a change agent, and so on and so on. There's a whole bunch of different processes that I've used in the groups and other people have brought in. So that's kind of a rough, and of course it includes some IFS too, of course. In fact, because people mostly have come from my email list, a lot of the people in the groups, in these 2 groups, already know IFS. I mean, some of them are IFS therapists even. So
Yeah. Jay, I love the way your mind works.
thank you.
Do you stay up at night thinking of these ideas?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes my most creative stuff happens in the middle of the night when I should be sleeping.
Or like in the grocery store line, you're like, oh, wow, that's a really good idea for that thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the intellectual creativity is a big strong suit for me. So I just love uh, that kind of thing.
And you clearly love educating and doing the groups. Like that seems to be like like educating people and using groups as a form of education also seems to be your like a passion.
You're right. I love groups. Yeah. We didn't even talk about the interactive groups that are based on IFS that I do. I mean, yeah, I'm not the only one who does this. I mean, it's a known thing in the group therapy world that you can do. Sometimes they're called process groups, and sometimes they're called interpersonal groups. Although there's a little different. I do my groups involve both. Basically, people in the group, as the group's going on, there I encourage them to notice what is happening in the moment, what parts are being evoked in the moment, and to speak for them, which is very exciting in itself. But then I also encourage people to talk directly to other people in the group about how they feel toward them, about, or
Mm.
like somebody might say, well, last week when you did such and such, I really admired you, or I was really intimidated by you, or I didn't like what you did, or whatever. And then the other person responds. Um, and then they might have interaction. And if they're feeling kind of connected to each other, they might work on a deeper intimate connection. And if they're feeling conflict with each other, they'll work on working through the conflict. But in the meantime, as they're doing that, being in touch with what parts are up and learning to speak for the parts rather than from the parts, and it's very powerful, and it's different. The healing that happens in these groups, I don't do deep pieces of individual work and heal exiles in those groups, but the healing that happens is largely through the relationships with the other
Mm.
people and the relationship with the group. So
Mm. Yeah,
that's
that's
a
beautiful. I love that. Well, yeah, I mean, if we when I'm like, if we ever or when we can learn to speak for our parts and not from our parts, like what a huge difference that makes. And I think about being like with IFS people and we can speak for our parts and we can connect and I can say, what's happening for me right now is this, that's what's coming up for me. And we can have those conversations. That's so different than how I can, how I am in my family or how I can be in my family. You know what I mean? Like we can't,
right.
I want to be able to do that in my family. And yeah, but how healing that is that to speaking of capacity, to go back to that, that I have the capacity to do it. Like, you know what I mean? Parts of me say,
Hmm.
you can never do that. You're, people please too much or too afraid. But then like, no, in this safe group here, I do have the capacity to do it. I know what it feels like. I'm practicing what that feels like. And that also helps me develop the capacity.
Yep. Yep. That's right.
I
Yeah, that's
love
right.
it.
So that's right. I didn't even mention that, but yes, you got it. People get to practice, interacting the way they would like to, and
Yeah.
take risks that they wouldn't
Yeah.
take in their life. But this is a safe group where you can take a risk to be assertive or to challenge somebody or to be vulnerable in a way that you might not in your life. Yeah.
Yeah. And then do you still do just basic IFS, like teaching IFS groups? Do you still do those too?
I have. I mean, right now, Bonnie's doing that.
Okay.
And
I'm
I've
like, how
and
many how many hours of the day do you have?
right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Um, and
So
I'm
Bonnie's
trying not
doing that now.
I'm
Okay.
trying not to work too much. Yeah. So she's really recently gotten, I mean, she's always liked teaching, but um, recently she's really taken on the basic class and the exiles class and is doing a great job of it. And I've got these other things that I'm doing. So I figure, fine, let her do that, so
Yeah.
they're still going on, but I'm not current. I may at some point, go back to teaching those classes, but not at the moment.
Do you also have a private practice or do you see people individually?
I do, but I haven't taken on. I've turned away a zillion clients. I haven't taken on anybody new in the last 8 months, and I'm probably not going to again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I still have 3 or 4 clients
Yeah.
that I work with, but I really focus these days on the groups and classes.
Yeah, that's great. So if people want to find out more about you, about your groups, how do they do that?
Well, the main website is personalgrowthprograms.com with hyphens between the words.
So my last fun question is, if there was anything that you could do, if you could do anything you wanted to, besides what you're doing already, what would you do? Like job-wise, fun-wise, like what would you do if you could do anything?
I got to tell you, I can't think of anything. I am doing the things that I want to be doing. That's one of my capacities that I've had for a long time. I think of it as a life purpose, like living your life purpose. That's what I do, so I mean, I want to develop what I'm doing a lot more. But right now, my passion is the capacity work. The thing I am starting to do is to bring some of the great turning stuff into the capacity work. For a while I thought, if people are just coming for personal growth, I shouldn't bring in things about the world and the great turning. And then I realized, these days, everybody knows we're in trouble.
Right.
And even if they're just coming for personal growth, they're not going to object if I bring in. So what I've started to do is each capacity has, in addition to how it relates to one's personal life and one's personal relationships, it also has to do with how you relate to the world. Like, for example, compassion. Can you have compassion for people that you read about in the news who are suffering? Can you have compassion for people who are doing harm in the world? So just as that's an example of bringing in the great turning work in directly into the capacity work. And that's kind of one of my latest little things that I'm, fooling around with.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Well, because think about that, right? If you're practicing compassion for others, you would think, we talked about this a little bit before, but you would think that would be like, okay, if I'm practicing it, it would be something that I get a little bit used to, and then maybe it'll be a little easier to practice it for myself. Or the more I practice it for myself, the more I can practice it for other people, especially people that are hard to have compassion for.
Right.
And there are lots of those.
Yep.
Well, Jay, this was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you, Tammy. You're a very good interviewer.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks for hanging out today. If you liked this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFS Tammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time.
Today's episode was sponsored by Brighter Vision. What's the point of having a beautiful website if it doesn't attract the clients you want to see? As the worldwide leaders of website design for therapists, Brighter Vision sees this issue happen way too often. A nice looking website doesn't equate to a successful website. The truth is, your current website might even be turning off potential clients. That's where Brighter Vision comes in. Brighter Vision's team of website designers will create a website that is centered around attracting and retaining your ideal client so that you can have a nice looking website as well as a successful one. Better yet, Brighter Vision is offering $100 off exclusively for listeners of the One Inside podcast. To take advantage of this offer, simply go to brightervision.com/inside. Again, that's brightervision.com/inside.